Colleagues, as you normally know, I don't normally read chair's notes because I think that most people have read these chair's notes about 150 times, and you haven't figured it out by now. You're never going to. But there are some changes, and I'm going to take this opportunity to read the chair's notes with respect to avoiding audio feedback. The first one is to prevent disruptive and potentially harmful audio feedback incidents that can cause injuries. Participants are reminded to keep their earpieces away from the microphones at all times. Second, in Monday, April 29th, the following measures have been taken to prevent audio feedback. All earpieces have been replaced by a model which greatly reduces audio feedback. New earpieces are here. The former ones were gray. These ones are black, and please only use black. All unused earpieces will be unplugged at the start of the meeting. When not using the earpiece, please place it face down on the middle of the sticker. So there's a sticker on the thing here. I'm sure my clerk's going to have to remind the chair to do that. Please consult the cards on the table for guidelines. These are the guidelines. The room layout has been adjusted to increase the distance between the microphones. It's more like a football field. It's kind of, I can barely see Brigadier General Adamson's name there, but I'm sure he's here. So those are the changes that have been put in place in order to cut down on audio feedback, which has been difficult for our translators, interpreters. So thank you all for your anticipated cooperation. And just a reminder to wait till I, as chair, recognize you, and a reminder that comments be addressed to the chair. So this is the start of our study on the defense of space, and I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour, Lieutenant General Blaise Frawley, Deputy Commander, North American Aerospace Defense Command, and Brigadier General Michael Adamson, Commander 3 Canadian Space Division. So welcome both Generals Frawley and Adamson, and invite whomever is going to make the opening 5-minute statement, and look forward to what you have to say, and then we'll go to our rounds of questions. So, is it General Adamson? Please, 5 minutes, sir.
Certainly. Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. Je suis le Brigadier Général Mike Adamson, commandant de la...
Good morning. I'm Lieutenant General Blaise.
I'm responsible for the administrative functions of the division, which includes the generation and development of personnel, strategic engagements with international allies and domestic partners, and identifying the operational capability deficiencies and needs. As the Joint Force Space Component Commander, I am responsible for the delivery and use of space capability to support Canadian Armed Forces operations at home and abroad. Space in the CAF has been evolving for over 20 years, with its first iteration, Director of Space Development, formed in 1997. 3 Canadian Space Division was established on the 22nd of July, 2022, representing the operationalization of the space domain within the CAF. This reorganization has streamlined how we meet our mandate, supporting CAF operations with space effects, maintaining space domain awareness, and defending and protecting military space capabilities. 3 Canadian Space Division is focused on the administrative business of the division, as well as developing and maintaining partnerships with our national and international space allies. 7 Wing was also stood up subordinate to 3 Canadian Space Division. They are primarily focused on planning and coordinating the actual delivery of these space effects. The space domain is also, as you can imagine, constantly evolving and changing. The growing accessibility of space means it is no longer limited to state players. Rather, we have seen incredible growth in civil and commercial activity and nefarious capability development by disruptive actors. This creates challenges as the space environment is becoming more congested, contested, and competitive, making it an increasingly difficult environment in which to operate. It also increases the vulnerability of critical capabilities, potentially affecting the long-term sustainability of space-based services. That is why Canada is working with other like-minded spacefaring nations to advance the development of responsible behaviors and to identify how to reduce the risks of misunderstanding and miscalculations in the space domain. As such, my priorities for the division are clear. 1, maintain relevance within Space Alliance frameworks. 2, maintain assured access to the space domain to support CAF operations at home and abroad. And 3, the continued evolution of the Space Division and the CAF Space Operations Enterprise. Since our establishment, 3 Canadian Space Division has been focused on increasing what I have dubbed the space-mindedness within the CAF. That is the mindset that acknowledges the critical dependency that every CAF operation and activity has on space. L'espace revêt une importance tout aussi vitale.
Space is just as vital to the day-to-day activities of Canadians. Space services power the stock market, provide intranet and cell phone services, get emergency services to where they're needed, and even deliver meals to our doorsteps. Part of my role is to ensure that space remains accessible and peaceful for the benefit of all, so that Canadians can continue to enjoy the services we rely on.
Invitation to speak to you today and the opportunity to build space-mindedness within the Canadian public, and I welcome your questions about space and defense. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gallant, 6 minutes.
Thank you. And this February,
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Please, 5 minutes, sir.
Les membres du
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am Lieutenant General Blaise Frawley, a Deputy Commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, which is headquartered in Colorado Springs.
En tant que commandant,
As Deputy Commander of NORAD, my role is to support General Gregory Guillot, Commander of NORAD, in the execution of our binational command's missions, namely aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning.
Within aerospace warning and aerospace control, NORAD relies on space-based capabilities every day for providing threat warning and attack assessment, communication, navigation, intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, weather tracking, and much more. There is nothing we do as a joint binational partner command that is not enabled or enhanced by space power. While NORAD is not responsible for space defense, General Guillot has expressed that awareness and protection of the space domain is absolutely critical. As modern threats continue to blur the lines between air and space, it is now more important than ever that Canada and the U.S. work collaboratively in both domains, such as we're doing with the Arctic Over-the-Horizon Radar Initiative, to defend North America and better integrate space-mindedness into our operational environment. Thank you, merci, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to address this committee, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Gallant, 6 minutes.
thank you. This February, the U.S. House Intelligence Committee Chairman, Republican Mike Turner, disclosed a new threat by Russia to deploy a new anti-satellite weapon. How imminent is this new threat?
Mr. Speaker, thanks very much. It's a great question and certainly an issue that concerns us significantly. We are working with the American Space Force and Space Command in order to understand what that threat might be and understand what implications that might pose to activities in the domain. We don't believe at the moment that there is any imminent threat, but certainly as we look with the Americans and our allies to understand what might be going on, that's certainly something that in due course would be communicated to those that would be implicated.
Okay, so it was indicated that the new weapon developed by Russia may utilize nuclear weapons to destroy satellites. How credible is it at this point that that is feasible to do in the near future?
I think as a feasibility, certainly it is a possibility, but I don't think that we're able to conclusively determine at this point that that is in fact what the nature of the weapon might be.
If Russia were to use nuclear bombs in space, what are the consequences if they were to detonate a nuclear device in low Earth orbit? Could you?
Certainly a great question and one that we're trying to understand ourselves. We've seen in the past, in the 50s and 60s, there were tests that were done with these kinds of weapons in space, which provided, I think, a bit of a benchmark in case something like that was to occur again. It's probably worth stating as well that international law prohibits the placement of nuclear weapons in space, so this would be a direct violation of that and certainly counter to accepted norms of behavior that we would expect from any spacefaring nation. The impact and implications of something like that, I think, think would be considerable in terms of what it might do to pollute the environment, how it might directly affect satellites that were sort of in the near vicinity of such a blast, and certainly it would be cause for concern that we might in fact lose some of the utility of some of those satellites if they're not appropriately hardened.
And impact on Earth?
It really depends on the altitude at which something like that would happen, but I don't think that we would expect there would be a direct impact on Earth.
Okay, so according to a leaked U.S. intelligence report, China is building a sophisticated cyber weapon, or more than one, to seize control of enemy satellites, rendering them useless for data signals or surveillance during wartime. How prepared is Canada to deal with this, and what is the financial allocation out of this budget to work towards getting our assets hardened?
Another great question. That really speaks to equities and expertise of my colleague on the Joint Force Cyber Component Command. That's certainly within their wheelhouse to understand that threat and how we might counter that. Certainly from our perspective, it is a concern. The space infrastructure that we concern ourselves with consists of activities or platforms of vehicles that are on orbit in space, obviously ground infrastructure that would be a concern, and then the link between the two, that the communication signal between those two, all of which are potential avenues for our adversaries to try and affect what it is that we're doing and degrade our capabilities. Any further than that, though, on the cyber front, I would have to defer to my cyber colleagues.
Okay, within the last several months, there was a satellite by China that came very close to one of our North American defense satellites. It was eclipsing our satellite for a while. Is there any indication that that Chinese satellite obtained any information or changed any of the coordinates or did anything to the North American defense satellite?
At this point, I would say that there's no indication that it caused us to change or would cause our allies to change anything that they're doing on orbit. Certainly, we watch that with great interest, and the ability to understand that kind of activity on orbit speaks to the criticality of space domain awareness and how important it is that we, either through our own contributions and also then being plugged into wider allied efforts, are able to understand who's doing what on orbit, if a satellite, for instance, is approaching one of our own, and being able to attribute those actions to whoever might be responsible for doing that activity.
Okay, so they're also saying that in the United States, the Intelligence Committee, that the nuclear weapons could be launched in space by placing the weapon into orbit. Is that possible right now? Do we know that it's not currently in place?
We've not seen that at this point, so I don't believe that that is something we're concerned with. Is it theoretically possible? Potentially at some point down the road, but not something that we're dealing with at the moment.
Okay, so back to the Chinese communist-owned satellites. What, if anything, do they have to do with these balloons, and have you had any more sightings or experiences with any of these balloons that were such a concern a number of months ago?
Speaker, I'll defer to my NORAD colleague.
Yeah, so as far as a link between the satellites and balloons, we at the unclassified level have not seen any link between the two, other than the fact that a balloon flying over North America could be collecting surveillance data. Talking about balloons, there are thousands of balloons that fly over North America every year.
But we're concerned about the ones that could be detrimental to our national security.
Absolutely. So when we have an unknown track and we think it might be a balloon, we first of all have to identify it as such, which is challenging given our domain awareness issues. In other words, our radar coverage does not go out far enough out over our coast and over northern Canada. Once we've identified what it is, we have to determine, is it a threat to North America? We haven't seen a similar type threat since February of last year, but we do assess every single balloon.
We're going to have to
Has
leave
your
that.
equipment improved at all so that you can detect more?
You'll have to work your answer back in on something else. Thanks. Ms. Gallant, Mr. Fillmore, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And Generals, thank you very much for making time to be with us today and for your service and that of your team that is with you as well. This is the first time the Standing Committee on National Defense has engaged on the topic of space. And so there is a lot that we don't know. I don't think there's anyone around this table that is would in any respect call themselves an expert. So I think that we're all kind of very cognizant that there's a lot we don't know, and I'm really looking forward to this exercise today and over the coming weeks of the study for us to understand those things that we don't know and need to understand better. The kind of way that we've framed the study is trying to get an understanding of how the role of space in national security and sovereignty, the role of space in how we fulfill our international obligations with international partners, and then the role for Canadian technology and industry to maintain that Canada remains a leader. And I'm hoping that today we can cover all those things, maybe not in the 6 minutes, but maybe I could start then with the last item I mentioned. We're seeing increasingly that the private sector is being turned to get things into space. Right now, Canada doesn't have a domestic launch capability. We're working hard on that at maritime launch. But this brings up the question of collaboration and cooperation and even interdependence on international partners. I wonder if you could talk about the role of the private sector in Canada and elsewhere in the world on achieving our space objectives.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, this is a great question, and it's an initiative that we've seen advance not just in Canada but certainly amongst our allies over the last couple of years. As previous commander of U.S. Space Force was fond of saying, space is hard. It's resource intensive, it's expensive, it takes a lot in order to field all of the capabilities that one would want in order to conduct space operations. As we look at that and the intricacies of space domain operations, it's become very clear to us and our allies over the last little while that this really needs to be a large team effort in terms of not just having defense capabilities, but certainly leveraging those of industry partners. We've seen that in current conflict environments where you've got industry providing information or assisting certainly in the collecting of information, if you will. But what we've done is, in order to recognize that and make sure that we're able to work collaboratively with our industry partners, is we're standing up something called a commercial integration cell within our own Canadian Space Operations Centre. This is mirroring the intent behind what we've seen in the U.S., where they have over a dozen companies that are part and parcel of that integration cell. It's something that we've worked through Interchange Canada to make sure that this is purely an ability for us to be able to speak at a classified level with industry partners to talk about what's going on in the domain, but separates any potential future projects or procurement or anything from that, so that we can sort of keep that compartmentalized. As we leverage industry and commercial capabilities, it's going to be really important for us to have that conversation and that dialogue at appropriate security classification levels. So it is certainly a change that we've seen in the paradigm of delivering space defense effects, and certainly, like I said, something that all of our allies are working on as we sort of collectively look at how we do this with partners in industry and defense and allies internationally.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
please.
Running on in your 5 minutes, Mr. Chair. So I'm in town for this, but also for a NORAD summit. This is a first-time ever NORAD summit. Our program within NORAD called STURDY, that's Science, Technology, R&D, and Innovation, annually brings in industry to Colorado Springs. And this is the first time we're actually doing it in Canada to encourage Canadian industry. We outline the challenges of the future, looking out 15, 20, 25 years for NORAD, and industry comes up with solutions. So you understand there's NORAD modernization, which is the Canadian project, but the modernization of NORAD is a long, continual thing that will continue into the future. And so we want to make sure that we not only include Canadian industry, but are there space capabilities that could help us with our future problems in the NORAD context?
Okay, thank you. Brigadier General, you mentioned leveraging the private sector to achieve our objectives, and it touches on what the Lieutenant General said as well. The result of this study will be recommendations to government. This would be a really good opportunity to let the committee know, and therefore let government know what we might do better or differently to make sure that we're able to leverage the private sector, to position the private sector in Canada, the domestic technology sector in Canada, for that kind of support role and commercial success as well. Do you have any reflections on that?
Certainly, yeah, Mr. Speaker, this is a great question and one that, again, we've been looking at over the last little while. When we look at the adversarial challenges that are out there, and we often refer to China as the pacing threat, trying to keep pace with that can be a challenge, and certainly probably the best organizations that are positioned to be able to move innovation and technological development quickly are going to be our industry partners. I think what we need to do is we need to be consultative with industry to understand what new technology they may be working on and where we might be able to utilize that for best effect. But certainly it's got to be a collaborative and consultative engagement that we have with industry as we go forward.
Okay, thank you. Please.
If I may, Mr. Chair, so one of the things that we run into the most when we hold our sturdy symposiums is classification levels. So when we talk the future of NORAD, we're talking at least at the secret level, if not at the TS level. U.S. companies, they take an effort, make an effort so that their companies have folks that are cleared right up to that level. Canadian companies, not as much. So they get excluded from the discussions that have to be at those levels. So if there's one thing I could change, it would be to encourage Canadian industry to obtain the classification level so we can have the discussion with them and we can include them.
To the planning and so forth.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you very much.
We have our first recommendation. Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci
Madame
beaucoup.
Normandie will speak en français.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your presence here today. I'd like to get back to one of the first things you said, Brigadier General Adamson. You mentioned that one of your roles was to identify operational deficiencies in the forces when it comes to space. Can you tell us about those deficiencies to start? Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I'll be answering in English because it's quite technical.
The identifying, that's one of the roles that we set out for the 3rd Canadian Space Division when we stood it up. There was no operational authority within the Canadian Armed Forces up until that point to look at that. And really, we talk to our allies. We take a frank look at the adversarial threat that is out there, and almost on a daily basis, we learn something that we didn't know to begin with that will speak to what we should be doing from a capability development perspective. The nature of the threats, the nature of activities in the domain change on a regular, daily, weekly basis, and certainly we need to be, I think, agile in terms of how we look at that. In terms of looking at capabilities we may not have now and ones that we might want to look at going forward, we have to do this in a holistic sense. We do something we call allied by design in terms of addressing how all of our allies work together to deliver space effects. We work very closely, obviously, with the Americans, with Australia, with the UK, and others. It's no point in us building something that already exists. I think we have to have a complementarity in our capability development efforts in order for us to be bringing something relevant to the table and being of value to our allies. And that's basically shaping the way that we're going forward and recognizing what we need to do next.
Merci. Mais justement, pour aller plus loin dans...
Thank you. To actually discuss this issue a bit further, what you've done, what would be the weaknesses that have been identified and that you're working on right now?
I don't know that I would, thanks very much for the question, merci beaucoup. I don't know that I would characterize them as weaknesses at the moment as opposed to understanding the threat environment. What we've seen over the last little while is a significant level of effort and development on the part of our adversaries to deny us the ability to be able to conduct operations in the space domain. Everything we do, whether it's aircraft or ships or tanks or a soldier walking through the woods, relies on some kind of space-enabled capability, whether that be a GPS, whether that be satellite communications or what have you. And our allies are looking to make sure that we maintain assured access to those things so that we can use them. Our adversaries understand that that is something that they would want to rob us of in order to then give themselves the upper hand. It becomes interesting when we go, well, that same GPS signal that is helping us formulate our plans to conduct military operations is the same one that's in your car that is getting you to the grocery store or getting the first responders to the heart attack victim or what have you. The same satellite communications that they would deny are the same ones that we rely on societally on a daily basis as well. So certainly there's added interest and impetus for us to be able to address those things.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'd like to get back to Madame Gallant's question about the nuclear aspect in space. There is a There is work ongoing at the United Nations to prevent the deployment of nuclear weapons in space. I'm wondering if, when it comes to space, there is something that is similar to deterrence that we would have on land for any nuclear threat. Is this a concept that exists? And if so, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Deterrence is it's a whole of government effort. And something like this is going to rely on a number of different departmental entities and stakeholders to be able to deter the adversary. Obviously, the impacts to something like this would not be felt just militarily, but they would have impacts to society in terms of our ability to access these services that I've just spoken about. But the deterrence component will come from Global Affairs Canada. It will come through sanctions. It will come through diplomatic means, démarches, and what have you. And certainly I can't speak at great length about that. The other deterrence is the fact that militarily, we want to our adversaries to understand that it's not ever going to be in their best interest to do something like that. The best way for us to deter adversaries is to maintain a strong, united front with our allies. When they look across the table and they see that we are part of a team, that is, I think, the strength in our deterrence capability. Our adversaries don't necessarily have friends and colleagues like we do in the West, whether that be through alliance frameworks or what have you. And really, it's important to maintain, I think, a strong and collaborative front in that regard to deter those kinds of activities.
Merci. Peut-être une question.
Thank you. A quick question. Space debris is an issue. We've heard a number of things like you'd need a laser or something to get rid of this debris. But realistically, what is being considered to address this issue of waste in space?
Okay, well, merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Is interesting. I think what we're going to have to see going forward is legislation globally, internationally, on norms of behavior that would state if you're going to launch a rocket into space, that it would be, behoove those launching parties to deorbit rocket bodies responsibly. If you have a satellite in space and it's going to reach end of life, make sure that you keep enough fuel on board to deorbit or to be able to dispose of it. At the same time, there's going to be, I think, business opportunities for folks out there or companies that come up with a great way of being able to either capture or dispose of debris in their own way. I've seen lots of sort of innovative ideas out there, from butterfly nets to lasers and everything in between. Debris is certainly a problem, and I think we're probably going to be hard-pressed to negate some of the debris or a lot of the debris that is out there. It's going to be in our best interest to make sure that we don't add to that problem going forward, and that's internationally.
Merci.
Normandy, Ms. Matson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much for appearing before us today. When the Canadian Space Division was first announced in 2022, you actually had informed the media that you wanted to reach that personnel level dedicated to the division of 270 CAF members. Now, we've seen a lot of there's been a ton of focus, of course, as it rightfully so, on recruitment retention issues within the CAF. And that other division that we're speaking about and building up, of course, is that cyber force. So we've been hearing in this committee a lot about all of the things that CAF need in order to be the strong force that they need to be. So that's appropriate housing, affordable housing, reasonable cost of living, you name it. As these responsibilities and those worries grow on CAF personnel related to all the things that I know that the general population in Canada also worry about, can you talk about getting to that 270 mark, how you've done it, how you want to continue to do it, and what personnel needs to see in your division to get to that 270 mark?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Mr. Speaker. So there are some elements of the question that I think I would best defer to our Military Personnel Command in terms of looking at things like housing and benefits and recruitment and retention issues that are squarely within their lanes, and they've certainly got a lot of effort going into programs to try and address all of those. From a Space Division perspective, we are growing towards that 270 goal. we are unique insofar as none of the folks that are working in the Space Division are coming directly off the street. So this isn't a recruiting issue. We typically take personnel that are already in the Canadian Armed Forces, Army, Air Force, and Navy. We are joint. And we bring them in. We will teach them what they need to know to be space operators. We'll retain them for the normal tour length, 3 or 4 years. And then they'll normally go back to wherever they came from, with the idea that at some point we'd bring that expertise back at the next rank level and they would be future space leaders. So I'm not worried about recruiting off the street in that regard. And certainly if we were to look around the Canadian Armed Forces to find people that may be interested in coming to us, that is the number one question I get when I speak at town halls is, how do I get into the space organization? It's absolutely fascinating for folks, and there's no shortage of potential applicants. To that end, I am blessed with the fact that I have a workforce that is absolutely thrilled about doing what they do, and to walk around the spaces for both 7 Wing and the division and run into people that are passionate about space and delivering those effects is really heartwarming for us. Yeah.
That retention piece, though, so maybe not recruitment, but retention certainly is an issue, and that competition that we see, of course, with the private sector. Can you speak to that and the issues that you're having on that end?
Yeah, great question. From our perspective, I don't see the retention issues within the Space Division, like I said, simply because I've got a highly motivated and highly enthusiastic workforce. Beyond that, in the larger CAF, again, that would probably be a question that would be better be posed to our personnel command folks.
Okay. One of the issues, of course, that we're also hearing a lot about in a re-examination, I think this comes up a lot, is that universality of service. Is there a potential to re-examine that and see that as a movement in terms of bringing people into that very exciting role and jobs that you have available in Space Division and maybe the elimination potentially of that universality, to open that more to people who don't want to leave CAF and want that exciting repost?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, that's a great question. I think it probably wouldn't come as a surprise to understand that most of space operations are done at a desk, at a console, in an operations center, as opposed to deploying perhaps in harsher environments where universality of service is a factor. It's probably worth noting as well that close to 50% of the Space Division at the moment is civilian personnel as well, which aren't obviously subject to universality of service concerns. And it's something that, we are well aware of the fact that if there are folks that have got restrictions on the universality of service, we are welcoming as long as they can do the job that we need them to do and be able to meet those requirements. There is an element of deployability with some of our folks. There is a possibility that we may deploy space support teams into the field to support deployed commanders, but for the most part, our work is done, locally within the headquarters environment, and certainly one we'd be able to accommodate certainly those U of S concerns.
Okay. We spoke, Mr. Fillmore was asking a lot about that private side, the commercial side, how we support Canadian industry, and it's good that we move in that way. It's certainly something burgeoning and something that we do need to work more on. Currently, the Americans, they have built a network of hundreds of spy satellites, but through Elon Musk's company. I know that I have a lot of questions about that partnership, considering our allyship and our extreme twined role with the United States. How reliant are we upon a company like SpaceX, for example, for our capabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess I would probably not characterize any of the SpaceX capabilities as spy satellites. They are really communication satellites that are designed to provide high bandwidth communications to a consumer customer. Now, I know that in the interests of understanding how that might work in a military context, there has been use of Starlink capabilities on the U.S. side to better understand whether or not that would serve a need for more communications. I don't think we can ever have too many communications capabilities in a military context. But as for our reliance on it, and from a Canadian perspective, we're not reliant at all on anything like SpaceX or Starlink for conducting any of our business, which isn't to say at some point we might not want to use SpaceX or another commercial provider for satellite communications in addition to military satellite communications that we use, but that would be the same as using the internet. So.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
Thank you. So, General Frawley, in response to Mrs. Gallant's question about domain awareness, actually her question about the possibility of further incursions into Canadian airspace, such as what we saw in the early months of 2023. You said that that our radar coverage is insufficient to detect these kinds of threats, or at least all of these kinds of threats. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. So, I mean, this has been identified numerous years. Our commander makes a report to both the Secretary of Defense and the Chief of the Defense Staff, highlighting that we have issues with domain awareness when it comes to our radar coverage. So if you look out beyond our coasts, both east, west, and in the north, once you get a distance off the coast, we have no radar coverage. In northern Canada, central northern Canada especially, if you look at a map of where everybody lives in northern Canada, where there's very few people, there's very little to no radar coverage, including communication coverage. That, again, has been identified, and that's why we are moving forward with over-the-horizon radar to solve that problem, covering those areas that are currently not covered.
Okay, so what's the delivery date of an over-the-horizon system that will correct all of these shortcomings?
Okay, so I can speak to over-the-horizon. It's OTHR Arctic, which is one of 2 Canadian radars that will be fielded by 2026. The polar variant, which will be situated further north in Canada, which will look over the poles. I don't have a date on that, but it's a number of years later. There's still a certain amount of R&D going on to figure out how to bounce off of the polar atmosphere. And the U.S. are in line with similar timelines, 2026, for their radars for the coasts.
Okay, so in 2022, the Auditor General reported that that it will take a decade for the Canadian Space Agency to launch a successor to RadarSat, and that an interruption in satellite Earth observation services past 2026 is a significant risk. When will we have a successor to RadarSat?
Talk about that.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Mr. Speaker. So we have been leveraging RadarSat-2 for a number of years to provide synthetic aperture radar, intelligence gathering or information gathering, if you will, overlaid with automated identification of shipping to look at the approaches to North America. RadarSat-2 then begat RadarSat Constellation mission, which we worked very closely with the Canadian Space Agency in order to deliver those effects. And I believe it was just last year, if I'm not mistaken, where there was an announcement for the CSA, a funding announcement in order to extend the lifespan of RCM. And I understand my CSA colleagues are following us today, so I'll let them talk about how RadarSat Constellation mission will be extended going into the future. Beyond that, we do have a program of record, Defense Enhanced Surveillance from Space, which will provide synthetic aperture radar, as we've seen now with AIS data, and then potentially other onboard sensors as well to contribute to our understanding of what's going on around the globe. Delivery timelines at the moment, I believe, are probably mid-2030s.
If I may go back to General Frawley, if RadarSat fails in 2026, as is the expectation built into the lifespan of that system, how does that affect North American air defense?
Mr. Chair, so we use RadarSat Constellation mission primarily for maritime warning, the third mission that I mentioned. It's not the only source of data. Clearly, there's RCM, and there's other data available. So it's blended in with significant other ISR data from other platforms to give us our maritime warning picture.
Okay, and you're gonna defer to our next panel on the expectation of replacement on that. You don't know when RadarSat replacement will be ready.
RadarSat Constellation mission, the 3 satellites I don't have any information on that, Mr. Chair.
All right. Well, do we have what of the capacity for? Is there capacity within the private sector to provide the information that we are waiting? Is there anything off the shelf that could be quickly procured for replacement of this system, or to replace the capability of the system?
Quickly procured and quickly answered. Very quickly then, Certainly, Mr. Chair. Yes, I fully expect that there would be some kind of civil or commercial capability that would be available for us in order to leverage.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Madame Lambropoulos, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here to answer some of our questions today. So I guess based on the conversation that we're having, it seems like we don't know much because it's a domain that we don't have very much research on, and just in general, we rely very heavily on our allies in order to have a united front to protect ourselves. What are some of the challenges, barriers specifically when it comes to emerging to an emerging domain such as this? What are specifically the barriers that we have in front of us, and are there any strategies in place to make sure that we get to where we need to be in order to be effective?
Great question, Mr. Chair, and certainly I would characterize not necessarily barriers, but things that we're working on, things that we need to make sure that we better understand would be space domain awareness would be a classic example of that. Understanding what's going on orbit, understanding what our adversaries, what other companies are up to. The domain is getting increasingly congested. There are far more actors in space than there used to be. It's not just nation states that have the ability to do this now, but a significant number of commercial actors that are out there. A lot of activity, and certainly understanding what's going on, being able to prevent collisions or potential impacts out there. So space domain awareness is probably one of the larger challenges that we're dealing with at the moment. We do this, or we maintain this awareness through a number of fronts. We have Canada's satellite Sapphire, which contributes to the space surveillance network in the U.S. For the amount of goodness we put Sapphire in, that contributes to the larger database, and then we get all sorts of great information out in terms of global awareness of what's going on. We're also part of an organization called Joint Commercial Operations, which is almost like crowdfunding space domain awareness. It leverages a number of satellite observation stations on the globe, radars, whether they be academia, commercial companies, industry, and all of those companies subscribe into the central database. They put all of their information in there. It's unclassified, and basically we collate all of that as one of the partnering nations, and are able to use that information as well to better understand what's going on in the domain as well. It is a challenge, and certainly I don't think we'll ever say that we have too much ability to understand what's going on in the domain, but certainly from a Canadian perspective, it's these international efforts and collaboration that allow us to maintain shared awareness.
Thank you. I actually I appreciate the fact that you brought up commercial actors. I know that Canada has an aerospace industry that is quite strong. Is there a way that, I know Ms. Matheson also raised this, but is there a specific way that we can, I guess, get them involved in a strategy that isn't just about data and sharing data, but actually creating equipment that could eventually help us get to a better place?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, a great question, and I think it goes back to some of the comments that General Frawley made earlier as well. We absolutely would love to collaborate more with industry and commercial entities in understanding what's going on, delivering space effects, and like I said, protecting our access to it in the face of potential adversarial actions. But that requires us to be able to have frank and at times classified discussions with our industry partners. It's something that we need to work on, that we can do better here in Canada, I think, in making sure that we're able to have those discussions with industry.
Thank you. And to bring it to a different place, I know you touched on it a little bit once again, but what do you think an increase in launch schedules from China and Russia could potentially mean for Canada? What are does it place us at a greater risk, or is there a threat to Canada? What do you think of those?
I think that we've seen a huge increase in launch pace over the last few years, going from maybe 100 to hundreds of launches per year. Each one of those launches potentially putting 50, 60 satellites at a time in orbit. That increased pace of launch has both an upside and a downside. There's an increased pace of launch because it's less expensive now, so there's a lot of opportunity there for commercial and industry partners to be able to take advantage of that. Conversely, though, if it's some of our adversaries, we don't know what they're launching necessarily. So, understanding what they've launched, where they've launched, what orbit it goes into, and then when it gets up there, what is it doing? These are questions that we ask ourselves and work very hard to try and understand, because not all of that is necessarily for peaceful or academic or scientific use. There are, of course, activities that are nefarious in nature, and we need to be able to attribute those activities. So the challenge in that regard is, like I said earlier, space domain awareness, understanding what's happening in the domain.
Okay.
And I just joined Mr. Fillmore and Ms. Lambropoulos. We're trying to up the knowledge base of the committee, and I appreciate that occasionally we'll lapse into acronyms. So if you could just catch yourselves and disaggregate the acronyms for those of us who don't deal with this on a daily basis. Thank you. Madame Normandine, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. There are a number of countries that are, shall we say, non-allied, who are interested in space for commercial reasons and also scientific reasons, and sometimes they hide some military purposes behind those other more acceptable purposes. I'm thinking of China, for instance. How can we militarily validate the scientific and other projects from these countries that are not like-minded, and make sure that we're not actually missing out on something that is hidden behind that veneer, if you will?
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, when we talk about China, we don't have much information on China, not as much as we have on other countries. That's a part of the problem. And when we talk about their intentions in space, I would look at their intentions in the Arctic in order to draw a link there. Every year we see some activity of a ship that is a supposedly scientific ship, according to China, that is close to our waters and our waters. If we, I think, draw links between that kind of activity on the part of China and what's happening in space, it's not quite clear what China is doing in space in that domain.
Absolutely, c'est correct.
That's correct.
Not going to tell us what it is that they're doing. They're not going to advertise, hey, this is a satellite or this is a capability that we're using for this purpose. And even when they may hint at that, the fact of the matter is we basically enter that with a suspicion that whatever is going on is probably at least dual purpose in nature. If it is an academic or scientific purpose, that it probably has some kind of military or intelligence gathering capability as well, because I don't think you can clearly differentiate between the two and compartmentalize those within the Chinese context. So to that end, all we really can do is continue to watch, better understand, and try and infer from their activities and their actions what's going on.
Merci.
2.5 minutes, Ms. Manson.
Thank you. Just sort of to build off, I guess, of what we were talking before, but certainly in terms of that private side, in terms of our arms trade, arms trades treaties, I wanted to ask, we've talked a lot about China. We've talked a bit about that, but what about the other players around the world? Could you expand more on North Korea, Iran, not Iran, but India? Canada does a lot of trade with countries like Israel in terms of space domain. We've now put forward a motion to really heighten our arms trade controls and those arms trade treaties. Can you speak to that and what that means in terms of space and those other players on the world front in like 2 minutes?
Merci, bonne chance. Great question. I'm not sure that I can speak to a lot of that. At the moment, where we're concentrating our efforts from the Space Division standpoint is working with our allies, closely to understand the sort of near and present threats from a military perspective. So that would, the obvious answers to that would be China, and Russia would be the other one. And we haven't talked a lot about Russia. Russia's really a space power in decline. They continue to launch, but not nearly at the rate that they would have in the past, and certainly not a rate that I think they would continue to enjoy. I think that sanctions and the activities, the illegal conflict in Ukraine are having adverse effects on their abilities to be able to do all of that. And certainly they're losing commercial customers in terms of launch because of their activities in that regard. So I think, from our perspective, we watch them carefully. They continue to field significant capabilities to deny us use of the domain, but we don't see them using the domain in nearly the same way or nearly as reliant as we have been.
30 seconds? Okay. So I mentioned Israel. You didn't respond. Do we share satellite space intelligence with them? And are they applicable to that arms trade treaty? How do we navigate that?
That I can't speak to. The CF Intelligence Command is the organization with the Canadian Armed Forces that does any work in that regard. That's not something that we work in at all. Thanks.
Mr. Bazan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank both our witnesses for being here. Good seeing you again, General Frawley. It's always great to have NORAD at the table, and General Amundsen, welcome to committee. Just to drill down more on the nuclear weaponization of space. The U.S., I know back in the 60s, did a number of nuclear tests, I think 5 under Operation Fishbowl. Knowing the impact back then, if the Russians decided to target satellites, how big a blast area are we potentially talking about, and how many communication satellites and other satellites that we have in space would be impacted at the various levels? Has anybody done that analysis, and especially...
Mr. Chair, that's a great question. There are a lot of variables in that, in the answer. It would really depend on the size of the weapon. So that would be obviously something we would be interested to understand if this was in fact a reality. Where on orbit it would be then detonated is also a concern. Low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, geostationary, or somewhere in between would certainly affect the blast pattern, the blast radius, if you will. Whether or not then those effects would reach across various orbital domains would also be something we'd be interested to try and understand. And then the long-term effects of that, obviously, there would be probably destructive effects with those satellite vehicles that would be in the direct line of sight of such a blast. The follow-on concern then becomes then the radiated space that is now existing afterwards that, again, depending on the orbital domain, other satellites might be going through then over the next period of time, whether that be hours, days, weeks, or what have you. The expectation is that that would have a deleterious effect, whether that would result in the destruction of those satellites, a reduced lifespan, or no effect at all remains to be seen. Certainly when those tests were done in the 60s, there wasn't nearly the on-orbit activity that we have now, so it would be kind of hard to assess that at the moment.
Okay, I appreciate that. But my understanding is that when one of those tests in particular, that over a third of the satellites that were in orbit at that time were impacted because of both the after effect plus the immediate blast. And you look at the exponential growth in satellites that are currently in our space, it would have a much greater impact and impact the way we do business. Like everybody relies on satellite communication. So speaking about that satellite communication, we talk about NORAD modernization. We talk about the F-35s coming online. DPU talks about having early warning aircraft and command, AWACS. What do we need in space to enable those platforms to do the NORAD mission, particularly in the Arctic?
Our Chairman, thanks for the question. So obviously anything linked to ISR is critical for us. So anything linked to especially polar over-the-horizon radar, given where it's going to be, it'll communicate through SATCOM to get its information back to our headquarters. Certainly communications SATCOM-wise, as I said earlier, we have huge gaping communication holes over northern Canada and clearly over the Arctic. If we're going to reach out and touch the Russian bombers before they launch their cruise missiles, which is our goal, then we're going to have to be able to get a long way north, and so we need communications that cover over the entirety of the northern pole.
And I appreciate that because I've seen the map where we actually have our North Warning System and how the entire interior of northern Canada and the entire Arctic archipelagos, with the exception of Alert and maybe Resolute Bay, are completely bare naked. Like there is no surveillance there at all. So the over horizon radar is important. But also, what about LEOs, low Earth orbit satellites, to help inform our early warning system as well? Is that something that NORAD's looking at? Is that something that's a part of the intelligence gathering that Space Command's are going to be needing?
So what I can say from, Mr. Chairman, from a NORAD perspective is NORAD doesn't do space. We rely on space. So we describe what our requirements are, and then on the U.S. side, U.S. Spacecom and U.S. Space Force will determine what is the best way to deliver that. And on the Canadian side, it would be DG Air and Space Force Development. So again, we very clearly highlight what we need, where our shortcomings are, but we don't actually determine is it best suited to be LEO, GEO, highly elliptical, et cetera, et cetera. Over.
Razan. Final question, Mr. Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and Generals, welcome to the committee. General Adamson, I'll start with you in terms of the commercial integration cell. I want to follow up on Ms. Matheson's question that she asked earlier in terms of working with industry. You've highlighted the benefits, and I think some of them are very obvious in terms of it's an expensive process that we're involved in, and so relying on the private sector certainly helps us lower the cost, I would think, for some of these initiatives. And it also drives innovation, right, in terms of supporting industry, and we'll see benefits there. I am fascinated, though, with our increasing reliance on industry. There is the politics of industry itself. I'll raise the Starlink issue with the Ukraine-Russia conflict. That was played out in a very public way. And so some in the public might say that an increasing reliance on the private sector or industry or for-profit organizations, there may arise in the future, and I'm not asking for your opinion on the Starlink situation, but there may be scenarios like that in the future where there's some question about security and partnerships, whether they're legal or not. How can the public be assured that we're protected with those agreements, knowing that there's an element of politics with some of these situations that arise?
Mr. Chair, that's a great question, and certainly an issue and a concern that we have lived with as we've looked at standing up our commercial integration cell, because obviously we want to make sure that there is no appearance of impropriety in dealing with a commercial company, such that their participation in this initiative would provide them some kind of undue advantage on a future project or procurement capability as well. And it's one that we've seen, like I said, our allies come to grips with as well. So you have to have, I think, very clear guardrails in place to make sure that you keep things appropriate. Certainly, I am much more beholden to policy advice in this position than I've ever been before, and I don't do anything without talking to my policy and JAG colleagues when we look at this. It's something that I think we're highly sensitive to, and something that is certainly looked at very closely as we go forward.
General Frawley, on that same issue?
Sorry.
Just in terms of private contracts that we have, there may be an element of politics in terms of positions that are held by corporations or individuals. And the public's assurance that with the increasing reliance on private industry, that the investments that we make will be protected in a time of conflict.
Yeah, so, I mean, on the NORAD side, we don't see near as much of that type of contracting, et cetera, as we do in other parts of the government and within the Department of National Defense. And most of that would be on the U.S. side as opposed to the Canadian side, which I'm not at liberty to talk about. So,
obviously, General Adamson, can I talk about the Wild West scenario that you talked about earlier in terms of with many issues, whether it's the space debris issue that was raised earlier, or some of the nuclear threats that were talked about, there really aren't a lot of structured international agreements at present that kind of talk about the rules of space. And knowing that we have some state actors who are unwilling to assist in that regard in terms of formulating those agreements, Russia, China being, I think, top of the list, how do we move forward with our allies in terms of creating some rules of order in an area where it is, I think, early days and still that Wild West scenario?
That's a great question, Mr. Chair. We, through a number of different organizations, but I'll highlight the Combined Space Operations Initiative, which currently, comprises of 10 nations, our Five Eyes partners, France, Germany, and then recently Italy, Norway, and Japan joined just before Christmas. It's a body that is represented by nations from around the world that are like-minded in terms of advocating for responsible behaviors, and certainly collectively we have the ability to be able to call out irresponsible behaviors on the parts of any nation, state, or even commercial actor that might be acting irresponsibly. What can we do other than obviously doing that collectively with the voice of a number of nation partners is maintain the moral high ground. I think from a Canadian perspective, certainly we need to take a look at how it is that we employ assets in space, how our own industry operates in space, and make sure that we're not doing anything that would call into question our responsible behaviors in that regard and set the example. And I know that our allies are like-minded in doing that as well.
Thank you. Mr. 20 seconds. Very quickly, the evolution of Space Division, you highlighted that in your opening. Can you talk about where we are 5 to 10 years from now, or where you hope we're at?
I think it's been an absolutely incredible journey these last couple of years. The space-mindedness of the Canadian Armed Forces has been increased. I think our joint force understands how important space is to everything that they're doing, but also, that they need to be sensitive to the fact that if that is degraded or denied to them, that they need to be able to work through it. So I think that educational piece is there. We will continue to do that over the next few years. We will continue to recognize capability areas that perhaps don't exist at the moment, but might become an issue or a concern. Space domain awareness will go beyond geostationary belt to cislunar space as we watch more and more missions heading out towards the moon, Mars, and potentially beyond. This space is the limit. It could be, who knows? I'll be interested to see myself.
Mr. Collins, and unfortunately, that brings our first hour to a close. This has been absolutely fascinating and a terrific start for the committee. Just before I let you get your well-deserved lunch. If NORAD detects some space threat that is such that it needs to be activated, is Canada entirely dependent upon the U.S. response to any threat about to be activated?
Okay, thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So NORAD doesn't watch objects in space. What we do is we watch launches, terrestrial launches towards space. Of course, what we're watching for predominantly is ballistic missiles or missiles that could become hypersonic missiles. We also see all reentries. We do this through what's called OPIR, Overhead Persistent Infrared. It's a satellite system that essentially watches the Earth constantly. But watching objects in space is absolutely a U.S. Space Command responsibility and Space Operations Command. We're obviously concerned about anything that might have been in space for a period of time and could deorbit and then become a ballistic missile or a hypersonic weapon. So always watching for reentries, but again, not monitoring space specifically. U.S. Spacecom does that. And as do our the Canadians in this block.
Is that a distinction or a activity that can stand in the current situation? So you're monitoring stuff leaving, you're monitoring stuff coming back in, but when it's out there, you're not monitoring it.
We're made aware of it.
Yeah, we're made aware of it.
We're made aware of it. And
but it's
what's
not
gonna,
NORAD that's looking at it.
No, it's U.S. Spacecom. Yeah, because that's their primary area of responsibility. And what's going to sort this out, and I think it was asked in a previous session, is CJAD C2. As we push information across all domains, all combatant commands, countries, NATO, NORAD, and are able to communicate and make decisions based on a pretty much similar architecture or system, we'll have the information available that we need. But we all have our specific focus areas. Our job is to defend North America, and Spacecom defends space as best they can.
Thank you for that. At least I think thank you. I'm not quite sure. That's the point of doing these studies. With that, colleagues, will adjourn while we re-empanel. Again, I want to really thank you for setting this study up. It's really been quite excellent. And General Adamson, you're welcome back anytime. Thanks, Ann. There we go. Yeah, well. Suspended. If you're adjourned, I'm sure those who think it's adjourned, they can all leave. So I'd like to welcome back our witnesses for our second hour. Majaduchik, welcome to the committee, and Gunande Krupnik, Director General Space Utilization, welcome to the committee. I apologize for my pronunciations. Hopefully we'll get a bit better over the course of the committee. With that, I will ask Ms. Jukic for your opening 5 minutes, please.
Do I press the button?
Just leave. Okay. Good afternoon, Chair, committee members. Thank you for the invitation to speak about the Canadian Space Agency and its role in Canada's space program. My name is Maya Jukic, and I'm the Director General of Policy at the Canadian Space Agency. I'm joined by my colleague, Gunadi Krupnik, Director General of the Space Utilization Program. L'Agence est l'organisme fédéral.
The agency is the federal organization responsible for Canada's civil space program. We work to promote the peaceful use and development of space for the benefit of Canadians.
Under the Canadian Space Agency Act, we are responsible for coordinating the government's space policies and programs, leading activities to advance space research and the applications of space technologies, promote the adoption of space technology by Canadian industry, and encouraging commercialization of Canada's investments in space. Ces fonctions nécessitent de collaborer avec nos collègues de tous les.
These functions require that we work with our colleagues across federal departments, including the Department of National Defense.
It is important, and not only for its role in our security and sovereignty. In 2021, Canada's space sector generated $4.9 billion in revenues and contributed $2.8 billion to Canada's GDP. It directly employed over 11,600 Canadians, majority in highly specialized STEM occupations, and supported more than 12,000 additional jobs in the wider economy. Canada's space firms are also highly innovative, investing $547 million in business-led R&D in 2021. Many of the activities that the Canadian Space Agency undertakes as the lead on Canada's civil space program contribute to safety, security, and defense. Ces ressources à double usage.
These dual-use assets underscore the importance of ensuring the resilience of space capabilities.
Program areas, space exploration, space science and technology, and space utilization align with our core mandate and functions. Under the Space Exploration Program, we lead Canada's participation in the International Space Station, our participation in the NASA-led Artemis program, and scientific missions to explore our solar system. Notre programme de science and
our Space Science and Technology program helps strengthen Canadian capabilities in disciplines that are important to both civil and defense space objectives.
Our space utilization program that Mr. Krupnik is responsible for ensures that Canada has the satellite capabilities to support our safety and security, to respond to economic opportunities, and to support scientific understanding of changes in our environment. The RadarSat Constellation mission is the flagship example of a dual-use asset led by the Civil Space Program that supports a wide range of federal responsibilities. It monitors the entire Canadian landmass and oceans on a daily basis, and the entire Canadian Arctic up to 4 times per day. Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces and our allies are the largest users of RCM data. They use this data for maritime and Arctic surveillance, real-time ship detection, and in support of deployed operations overseas. Ensuring the resilience of the RCM means protecting the Canadians who benefit from the services that it supports. In fact, we are currently developing an additional satellite to extend the operational life of the RCM. We are also in early stages of developing a next-generation satellite system to succeed the RCM. This initiative is called RadarSat Plus, and it will ensure continuity of essential satellite Earth observation data to numerous federal organizations so that they can continue delivering services to Canadians. Je vous remercie encore de...
Thank you once again for the invitation to speak today. We'd be glad to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Ms. Gallant, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The race to land on the dark side of the moon is on, and the communists who control China appear to be winning this race. What defense and security threats could this pose for our nation?
Canadian Space Agency is working on a peaceful exploration of space, and we are working with our partners on peaceful return to moon to stay and to work on behalf of humanity to advance exploration. It's not within our mandate to assess threats of other nations with their actions.
Okay. Well, this is the National Defense Committee. Given that neither Russia nor China are interested in taking part in the Artemis Accords, which I think you obliquely referenced, should peace-minded countries be planning a type of NATO with, of course, a wider area of operation and responsibility in order to mitigate or deal with any potential security threats? Or are they already?
Mr. Chair, this falls outside of the mandate of the Canadian Space Agency. We cannot comment on those matters. I'm happy to talk about why Canada is part of the Artemis Accords. And as my colleague, Mr. Krupnik said, we're in it to work with other like-minded nations on the peaceful uses of space.
Okay. Does the Canadian Space Division work together with the Canadian Space Agency at all? Do you have any of your personnel that are co-located in one spot?
We do coordinate and collaborate with Department of National Defense on many aspects, including Space Division. We coordinate our space surveillance activities, and we have been discussing for a while potential participation in exchange of personnel. But we do maintain very close relationship.
Okay, but there's no co-location. All right. No. Satellite spoofing, how, if at all, does that impact the Canadian Space Agency's operations?
Taking into consideration that we are more concerned with the peaceful use of space, where we see a lot of spoofing is, for example, RadarSat Constellation mission has two payloads. One of them is automatic identification of ships, and this is where very often we see spoofing occurring. But how it is dealt with, this question, Department of National Defense will be better positioned to answer.
I'm just going to hold your time here for a second. Can you give the committee a kind of an operating definition of what it means by satellite spoofing?
It's a very wide term and has many aspects, but basically, like for example, in a case of automatic identification of ships, it's when a ship transponder would send misinformation either about its location, its purpose, its cargo, and other information. So that is one of the examples. But basically, another very wide area where it is very pertinent is positioning, navigation, and timing, systems like GPS in the United States, Galileo in Europe, where adversary actions can affect the accuracy of signals and provide completely erroneous information for operational purposes.
Thank you. Ms. Galan?
So we have widespread cooperation with respect to the International Space Station. Why can't the countries agree on a similar type of agreement when it comes to the moon, space landings on the moon? What is it that is preventing an agreement like the International Space Station from coming forth with respect to the moon?
The cooperation on International Space Station is specifically between the partners on the station. So Canada, the U.S., Japan, European Space Agency, and Russia. So all operations of the station and participation of these nations in the program is guided by that agreement. I think we are still, it's fair to say, some years away from nations who want to participate in the peaceful exploration of the moon forming an actual partnership. So it might be something that will come in the future. It might involve the participants that are currently collaborating on the International Space Station and perhaps beyond that. But at the moment, it is not yet formalized or in place.
Also, if I can add very quickly, we do already have example of collaboration, like, for example, Lunar Gateway, that Canadian Space Agency participates. That is very similar to what ISS is in LEO orbit. That will be in cislunar orbit. And Canada plays a very prominent role in this one.
Thank you. Mr. Fillmore, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our guests for spending your part of your day with us today. Very grateful for that. Wanted to just ask you maybe a quick update on the Artemis mission, where in the timeline we are, and maybe just unpack a little bit what that mission is, what will be happening, if you're in a position to do so.
That's a little bit of a technical question when it comes to unpacking the mission. So Artemis II mission preparations are currently ongoing. Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen is scheduled to fly on that mission. He will be the first non-American astronaut that will fly around the moon, so a big accomplishment for Canada. Currently, the launch is not expected before the September of 2025. But you will appreciate, based on the testing and the results from the Artemis I mission, these timelines are in flex, and in the end, it will depend on the readiness of the system.
And what is the mission itself? What do we hope to learn or achieve?
So that will be the first crewed flight of the Artemis, the rocket. It will, the first one tested the technical aspects flying around the moon. This one will have humans in the rocket and will test the procedures that go with the flight. So I would probably lie if I said they will fly about 10, 11 days around the moon. And during that time, they'll evaluate a large number of systems that maintain the life on the rocket, but also technical things related to the flight itself.
Okay.
And if I can add, it will fly beyond moon, and it will be actually the first furthest in space foray of human beings.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. So this is the mission's really about sort of establishing the way that we're going to be in space in the future. That's wonderful. I want to switch now to. I mean, you've clearly identified that science is at the core of what you do and knowledge seeking. I met recently with a group of astrophysicists at St. Mary's University in Halifax who are very interested in being involved in what will replace the Hubble telescope, the outward-looking telescope, the telescopes that survey deep space, not turn around looking back at Earth for defense and so forth. In what way does the Canadian Space Agency touch projects like a new outward-looking space telescope?
The Canadian Space Agency currently participates in the James Webb Telescope with international partners, and we maintain expert capacity in the agency, staff that work on astronomy and planetary science missions. We participate in a number of ongoing missions, but going forward, we're exploring potential partnerships with other nations, including on some of the ideas that come currently from the Canadian astronomy community. So usually our science efforts are consulted with the scientific community across Canada, regardless of the domain of study, and our search for potential future opportunities is in line with the priorities of the community.
Okay, thank you. As I understand it, both Hubble and James Webb are pretty much ready to be retired. Maybe Hubble is already retired, I'm not sure, and that a replacement is needed, and that James Webb has some constraints. I'm not a scientist in this nature, but whether it's spectrum constraints or infrared constraints, a full spectrum of observations not available through James Webb, but its replacement might be able to fill in those missing gaps in observation. I'm trying to figure out what Canada's role in this international partnership is, and whether the role really lands with the Canadian Space Agency, so that we could support it effectively.
The Canadian Space Agency contributed instruments towards that mission. Technical aspect of it is also outside of my domain, so I wouldn't be able to speak to exactly what the instruments do. One of them helps with navigation, fine guiding and navigation, and the other one has a scientific purpose. So Canada actually is one of the key partners in James Space Telescope mission.
Okay, thank you very much. Where the committee's not looking, although we are the National Defense Committee, we're not looking only at the defense, the role of space in defense. We're also looking at space observation and its importance. So swiveling that sort of imaginary telescope back to Earth, what role does Canada Space Agency have in sort of like environmental observation or and that kind of thing? What do we learn from the Space Agency to help us manage the planet?
Unfortunately, Mr. Fillmore was a little slow on the swivel, so he ran out of time. Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madame Jukic, Mr. Krupnik, for being here today. Much appreciated. I'd like to hear about this dual use notion that you mentioned in your opening statement. Cooperating with defense on occasion, could that sometimes have some downsides? We know that procurement in the area of defense is very slow. Can that have an effect on some of your programs, like, for instance, causing delays because there are further regulations to comply with? What's the relationship with defense in that sense? Could it mean hindering you in some ways?
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very relevant question.
That we collaborate and coordinate requirements with the Department of National Defense, as well as with a large number of other government departments to harmonize needs on behalf of the government of Canada. But we have a completely independent procurement route, and we usually acquire our assets independently. Of course, we always coordinate and use interdepartmental governance mechanism for decision making, but I would say we have not seen impediments, procurement dependent impediments you're alluding to in past procurements.
Intéressant, des bonnes nouvelles. On aime ça.
Good news is always a good thing. We like that. Now, on the issue of coordination with the various state departments in the U.S., we know that there is a National Space Council. Kamala Harris is responsible for that. We don't have anything equivalent on the federal side here that the Prime Minister could chair that could allow for coordination between the federal government and the industry. Is this something that would be useful for the Canadian Space Agency to have this type of an entity?
Excellent question. Canadian industry and industry associations have been asking for better federal coordination on space issues, and so just in the last budget, the government announced the creation of the National Space Council, Canadian version of it. It will be a whole of government coordination mechanism that will ensure coordination on cross-cutting issues between civil, commercial, as well as defense space domains. You'll appreciate that that's a recent decision, and we're still working through the implementation details, so those will be forthcoming shortly.
Merci. 2 questions, 2 bonnes nouvelles. On apprécie ça au Comité de la Défense.
2 questions and good news for both of them. It's much appreciated at National Defense. I'd like to hear about RadarSat. There was some mention made. The idea that there may be a gap in data collection before the next version of RadarSat is in play. How does it work for cooperation with our allied countries in terms of cooperation? Is there something that Canada has to offer the allies in exchange for that information? How does that work?
Excellent question. Merci.
Excellent question. Thank you very much. Of course, the solution, there are at least 4 aspects at this point.
First of all, it's open data. We are promoting within the government family wide use of free and open data, which is more and more available. The second element is commercial data, and there are international and Canadian capabilities that we are very interested in. The third element is sovereign system, and RadarSat Constellation, RadarSat 2, and upcoming RadarSat Plus addressing that element. But the fourth element is international collaboration. And we have very close relationships with our allies, very close relationships with EU, European Space Agency. We have an arrangement for contingency planning with European Space Agency. For example, about a year ago, European Union lost Sentinel 1B satellite, and they acquired our support, and we're providing them support with respect to that. Reciprocally, we expect that if something happens on our side, they will provide us with support. We are working very closely with Japan's space agency, JAXA. We have a memorandum of understanding, and we have a very active exchange of RadarSat Constellation data in exchange of ALOS-2 and upcoming ALOS-4 Japanese satellites L-band synthetic aperture radar data over Canada. We have excellent relationships with our closest partners at NASA, and NASA is going to launch, in partnership with India in a few months, a NISAR mission, which will have great coverage at 6-meter resolution at L-band SAR over Canada. And we made an agreement that we will provide RadarSat constellation data over Greenland, and we'll get in exchange NISAR data in Canada. We continue discussions with a number of other like-minded nations with whom we hope to have as productive relationships as I just mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Normandine. Thank you for all that good news. Apparently not everything is broken. Ms. Matheson, 6 minutes.
First off, so the United Nations has been working on space and agreements and protocols around space disarmament for years. The U.S., Russia, China, they're investing in the militarization of space. And last week, the United Nations resolution against nuclear weapons in space was vetoed by Russia. Can you talk about the status and the state of space disarmament and the work that Canada is doing or needs to do, how we need to invest in that to ensure that our diplomatic efforts are recognized in this regard and progress further?
Mr. Chair, this question falls within the responsibility of the Global Affairs Canada. Canadian Space Agency is engaged in the multilateral fora, so we do participate in the work of the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Space. But on the issues of disarmament, our support is for the Global Affairs Canada colleagues that lead, and our D&D colleagues that lead that engagement.
Okay. You spoke just in response to Ms. Normandine's questions. It was about that dual use, certainly in terms of cooperation internationally. Spaces that new frontier, the next frontier, where it is possible to further the relationships that we have internationally in ways that we haven't been able to do on Earth because of various reasons. In terms of how we build that piece, that sharing of information that you were talking about, and I think about in terms of search and rescue, climate change information, how can Canada be a leader in terms of that regard to build further those relationships, and how necessary is that?
We are very proud of the fact that Canada was one of the founding members of International Charter on Space and Major Disasters. That is organization which recently celebrated its 20th anniversary, and today it brings together 17 international agencies. Canada, European Space Agency, and a French Space Agency have been founding members of this organization. And this organization provides free of charge Earth observation data anywhere in the world when the major disaster hits. We are a very active contributor to this organization. Both RadarSat-2 and RadarSat constellation mission data are provided to calls of that organization. And we are very proud that because of implementation of fast tasking capabilities on RadarSat constellation mission, RadarSat constellation mission data is among the first being delivered to disaster mitigation teams anywhere in the world.
Is that only with allies?
No, it's anywhere in the world.
So this is an opportunity if there's somebody else at risk, some other country that we're not necessarily on friendly terms with per se, this is an opportunity for us to say, here's this information to save lives. And it comes down to that saving of human lives.
That is absolutely correct.
That's the goal.
And we are partnering with United Nations organizations, and almost every country has so-called authorized users. Those are usually analog to our public safety government organizations responsible for public safety and disaster mitigations, and they can activate the charter anytime when major disaster happens.
You stated that Canada is a founder, is one of the first in this field. We often need recommendations for committees going forward. Are there things that Canada can do now to expand on that, to make that stronger, to be a leader in that?
I think we are already a leader. We are just finishing our leadership of this organization. This organization has rotation leadership every 6 months, and we are just finishing our 6 months of leading this organization with EUMETSAT, European Meteorological Agency, and I believe that our reputation within the organization is very high.
So this would be similar to something like that, the Arctic Council that we see. Are the conflicts that occur on Earth and away from those organizations, do they hinder? Have you seen any sort of hindrance of your work in that regard, like we kind of saw with the Arctic Council in Russia?
Maybe I can take that one. We currently, as I mentioned, have a active collaboration on the International Space Station that involves Russia, and to this day, the main objective of all the partners that are involved in the program is focused on maintaining the safety of the program, safety of the station, and safety of the crew. So we have not seen issues so far. But in all fairness, the participants on the space station depend heavily on each other. So that really drives the interaction.
Thank you, Ms. Madison. Colleagues, we have 25 minutes worth of questions and 20 minutes worth of time. So I'm going to start off with Mr. Allison with 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our guests who are here today. As you're looking at what's going on around the world in terms of space, can you give us a status update on what's going on with the Chinese space station? Do you have any details for us and where they're at and what's going on with them?
I would not be able to offer any details on that topic.
We don't have close partnership or collaboration with China. We are focusing on work with our allies and partners.
Okay. Well, thank you. I guess I got another question in terms of we don't have a lot of capacity when it comes to launch. I know we talked about partners and stuff. I guess my question is, talk to us about, is that something we should be trying to look at in the future, is the ability to be able to launch and do more of these things, or is that not cost effective and we should just continue to work with our partners on that?
As you are probably aware, there are several commercial entities in Canada who are trying to establish commercial launch capabilities in Canada. It falls under the mandate of Department of Transport. We are providing expert support to Department of Transport related to launch activities, but they would be better positioned to answer to those questions.
It is a growing space sector domain. So Canada having domestic capabilities in launch would complete the spectrum of capabilities that we have in Canada. Canadian Space Agency usually collaborates with international partners on our missions, and so that includes the launch of our assets into space. So at this point in time, we're using other available sources, but should there be a domestic launch capability, it would certainly position the Canadian space sector to take a good share of that growing market.
And to your point, you said you're working with a number of Canadian companies right now. How far off would you say that is? Is this a realm of possibility in the short term, or is this something that is going to be in the distant future?
I would not speculate on behalf of commercial entities, but there are very solid cases in Canada which have good chances for success.
Thank you. So I've only got about a minute left, and so I guess my question is, you guys talk about threat assessments is part of what you guys do, or at least you have them to be aware. What would if satellites were taken out in terms of communication for our country? What type of backups or redundancies do we have, and how would that leave Canadians should there be an issue in terms of compromise regarding some of the things that you guys are looking after?
Being a Canadian space agency, we are concerned more with making sure that we are not denied of those capabilities in space. That means resilience, that means building partnership which can supplement our assets. Where it comes to replacing space capability with others, it falls within the responsibilities of other government departments with whom we are working very closely, but they would be better positioned to answer that question.
Okay, thanks.
Allison, Ms. Lalonde, 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you. We briefly touched on the mission of Armistice. We also spoke, and my colleague did spoke about Russia, China not being signatory of an accord. So I would like to reflect back as Canada being one of the signatory on the Armistice Accord. And that was initiated by NASA regarding the exploration of space. So the principles set out in these accord are intended to apply to civil space activities conducted by the civil space agencies of each of the signatory. Section 11 specifically talk about the confliction of space activities. That sections speak primarily and states that the signatory commits to seeks to refrain from any international actions that may create a harmful interference with each other's use of outer space in their activities under these accord. I would like to hear a little bit from you about maybe explain the importance of the Armistice Accord and ensuring that the space domain is more predictable and more secure.
So the Artemis Accords are a set of high-level principles, as you pointed out, established originally by NASA with the support of a handful of agencies, and currently numbers are growing, so hitting 38, 39, so definitely growing, with the objective to ensure sustainable operations in the lunar environment. Through Artemis Accords, Canada is really supporting the next stage in human space exploration. The objective for many space agencies is this sustainable human presence on the moon. So going back, landing on the moon would be the first step, but all of the big international space agencies are talking about staying there and living and working on the moon and setting the norms of behavior while we are all on the moon eventually is one of the key elements. Canadian Space Agency, as one of the early signatories, is also taking a leadership in promoting the Artemis Accords amongst the international community. And next month, we are actually hosting this community in Montreal for a workshop where they'll talk about concrete steps to ensure some of the norms are implemented in the way you were describing. So deconfliction of activities on the surface of the moon, and how that would work, they'll be working through some of those questions during the workshop.
This seems like a lot of work, and I would say from a transparency perspective, how important it is that we have this open dialogue among the most countries possible to ensure that if we were, well, actually, it's not if we were, when we land and we decide to inhabit it, like stay on the moon, what would happen? Like, what's the importance of that transparency aspect?
It's going to be critical if many nations, not a select few, like was the case with the International Space Stations, are to work and live together on a planetary body.
1.5 minutes. Ms. Normandine.
Merci beaucoup. Ma question va aller un peu dans le même sens que ce qui a été dit pour
I'll follow up on what Madame Nanon was asking. We kind of have the feeling that it's almost as though it's a space race 2.0 at this point. You did mention people living on the moon, etc. But beyond that, what are the next goals? What do countries want when we talk about space in a broad sense?
Mr. Chair, that speaks to the question of inspiration and knowledge and understanding of our universe, and really through that understanding of who we are and where we come from. Moon is the closest to us at the moment. It's not the only destination. It's one step towards the next stage of human exploration, which is Mars. You will appreciate that going to Mars would be, from a technological perspective, way more complicated, including serious effects that such a trip would have on human body. So making these calculated steps over time will help us understand the impacts of space. It's a really harsh environment, and prepare better for the next stage in terms of travel to deep space.
1.5 minutes, Ms. Madsen.
I guess a furthering of that, we talked a lot, and I think you mentioned it too, in terms of that the commercial data, the commercialization of space, that potential private interest of space. So in all the things that states and nations are trying to achieve in that exploration, in that ensuring that we keep science and inspiration at the heart of it, how do we protect, ensure that monetization doesn't come into play when it requires a lot of money to get there?
Commercialization of investments in space is actually one of Canadian Space Agency's responsibilities under our mandate, under our act. So we don't object commercialization of these investments. Through, I'll give you some good examples. Through advancement of our robotic capabilities, we've advanced certain technologies that are used on Earth. So very precise robotic medical technologies used in breast cancer detection come out of that investment in Canadarm. And there are similar investments in science that have translated into improvements for life on Earth. So in that sense, we actually make it part of our mission to seek out both technologies and areas of research that have a potentially application for life on Earth. So currently, as part of the investments in our space exploration technologies and knowledge, we're looking at health-focused technologies, and we're looking at food-focused technologies.
Thank you, Ms. Madsen.
Thank you.
Mr. Brazan, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses for being here. So just so I'm clear on this, Canadian Space Agency is the lead agency in approving any Canadian government assets that are going to be put into space. Is that correct?
Civil space, because
Pardon me?
we are responsible for coordination and acquisition of assets for civil space Canadian programs.
Okay. I'm cutting in a note here on my hearing device. So if you're just on the coordinating side, then who's the lead agency then that's responsible for the replacement of the RadarSat constellation?
It's a very good question, because Canadian Space Agency is responsible, and we have received funding in 2023 for RadarSat Plus program that Maja Đukić mentioned in introductory remarks, and we are implementing a RadarSat Plus program. Nevertheless, there is a defense program that Department of National Defense would be better positioned to talk to.
So how many of the assets that CSA is currently working on are multi-purpose, that they are there for the Government of Canada, they're there to support civilian infrastructure like communications, but also provide services to the Department of National Defense?
So currently, again, as we mentioned in introduction, RadarSat Constellation mission is one of those. RadarSat 2 is another one. As well, we work together with Department of National Defense and their research arm, DRDC, on two microsatellites. One of them is still being operated by CSA, NeoSat, and we share 50-50 tasking of that satellite for science and defense research. The second one, M3MSat, currently is operated by private entities, but before 2021 was operated on behalf of D&D by CSA. As well, CSA is buying commercial AAS data for the Government of Canada, and D&D is one of the departments who benefits from that commercial data buy.
So you mentioned DRDC, the Defense
Yes.
Research Development Canada. How much collaboration does CSA have with DRDC? Is it goes beyond just that one platform that you're talking about, or is it multiple platforms?
So with DRDC, under Memorandum of Understanding between Canadian Space Agency and Department of National Defense, we have so-called Accord Committee, which coordinate research and development for civil and defense purposes.
The so as we look into the future and we look into the potential weaponization of space that would be impacting upon the mission of CSA, what actions is the agency taking to protect those assets, or what collaboration are you undertaking with the Department of National Defense?
Very briefly, please.
Department of National Defense is responsible for protection. We are coordinating our planning activities with them.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Mr. Fillmore, final 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. We've discussed at various times today with you and with the previous panel the general notion of good behavior in space. It's sometimes referred to as the norms of conduct in space. One of the things we've talked about is the threat of debris, space debris, whether it's from scientific endeavors or from malactors blowing things up or that kind of thing. What is the interface with the Canadian Space Agency, or what role can the agency play in negotiating treaties with other countries that are exploring space?
Within the civil space program, Canadian Space Agency has a number of active agreements, bilateral agreements with nations with whom we work closely. NASA obviously would be one of our largest partners, so we have an agreement with them. We have a long-standing cooperation agreement with the European Space Agency since 1979. In fact, it's going to be 45-year anniversary this year of the cooperating agreement with the European Space Agency. And then with some more recent newcomers to the space world, agencies with whom we either share common interests. So we just recently in Colorado Springs expanded our collaboration with the UK Space Agency. We collaborate with Australians, with New Zealand, individual nations in Europe. We have long-standing collaboration with the French. A couple of programs with them as well, Italians, Germans, so broad engagement with a number of key space partners, all in the domain of civil space.
Okay, thank you for that. Sure, yeah, go ahead.
If I can add to that very briefly, we work also under UN corpus with other nations on developing international guidelines and rules of good behavior. As well, we are part of interagency debris mitigation committee, where we are working with other nations. By the way, Russia and China are part of that committee. As well, on our side, CSA is contributing to the space situational awareness data through the NEOSat satellite, but also we have developed a sophisticated analytical tool called CRAMS. It's a Conjunction Risk Assessment and Mitigation Tool, which assesses probabilities of collision in space and works out recommendation for potential maneuvering for satellites which can avoid such collisions.
Does that mean that you or someone is tracking the debris?
We rely on data provided by international partners.
Okay. You mentioned Russia and China a moment ago, and it leads me to the question, are there any gaps in treaties on norms of conduct that the committee should be aware of? Are there countries that we have some work to do with still on this?
With Russia and China, we would engage through the multilateral fora. And in those cases, Canada lines up with its key allies, so we coordinate, as the generals were explaining previously. We coordinate our engagements in those committees. I guess I would say you want to be engaged. Communication is never a bad thing. And communicating even with your adversaries is a good thing. You want to know what is going on, and these multilateral fora allow for that type of conversations.
I think I might have a minute.
No, you don't.
I do not have a minute.
No.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I tried to brainwash you.
Yeah, it's only 4 minutes, not 5. Thank you, Mr. Fillmore. And I wanted to thank both of you for your presence here today. We're just beginning our study, and the information that you have will be very informative to our ongoing study. So thank you for your attendance. And with that, colleagues, the meeting is adjourned.